The day my wife announced I'd be paying her rent to live in my own house, I was debugging code that had been giving me hell for 3 days straight. The irony wasn't lost on me. Fixing problems that shouldn't exist had become the theme of my life. "Quentin, we need to talk." Jolene's voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to dread over our 3 years of marriage. It was the same voice she used when explaining why her writing retreats always seemed to coincide with Greg Morrison's real estate conferences. I saved my work and turned around in my home office chair. Jolene stood in the doorway wearing her power outfit, the black blazer she'd bought for networking events that somehow required overnight stays in downtown Chicago hotels. "What's on your mind?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. For weeks, she'd been dropping hints about financial independence and equal partnership in our marriage. The hints had gotten less subtle after her name went on the house title following our first anniversary. "I've been thinking about our arrangement here," she said, gesturing around the 3-bedroom colonial I'd bought 2 years before we met. "It's not fair that you get to live here for free while I contribute nothing." I blinked. "You contribute nothing because you chose not to. The mortgage is in my name. I put down the down payment with money I saved working 60-hour weeks at Nexus Technologies." "But my name is on the title now," Jolene said, stepping into the room. "That makes me half owner, so really, you're living in my house too." The logic was so twisted, it almost impressed me. "Okay, where are you going with this?" "You'll pay rent now. This is my place too." She crossed her arms, clearly expecting an argument. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. 3 years of marriage had taught me to recognize when Jolene had rehearsed a conversation. The slight upturn of her lips, the way she shifted her weight to her left foot. She thought she'd cornered me. "Interesting idea," I said calmly. The response clearly wasn't what she'd expected. Her confident posture wavered slightly. "You think it's interesting?" "I do. If we're going to treat this as a business arrangement, we should do it properly." I turned back to my computer and opened a new browser tab. "What did you have in mind for rent?" Jolene moved closer, her confidence returning. "I was thinking $1,500 a month. That's fair for half the house." I nodded thoughtfully while typing "Commercial Property Management Chicago" into the search bar. $1,500, and I assume as the landlord, you'll be handling maintenance, property taxes, insurance? "Well, no, I thought we'd split." "If I'm paying rent, then you're my landlord," I interrupted. "Landlords are responsible for maintenance and carrying costs. Tenants pay rent for the privilege of occupying space." Jolene's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I meant." "But that's how rental agreements work. Unless you're thinking of something more like a roommate situation. In that case, we'd need to establish clear boundaries about shared spaces, guest policies, pet regulations." As I spoke, I was scrolling through property management websites. Jolene's terrier, Princess, chose that moment to bark at something outside, her shrill yapping echoing through the house. Pet regulations? Jolene's voice had an edge now. "Oh yes. Most rental agreements have strict pet policies. Deposits, monthly fees, breed restrictions. Princess would definitely fall under the small dog category, but her behavior issues might be problematic. Princess had destroyed 2 sets of curtains, chewed through a leather recliner, and had never been fully house-trained, despite being 4 years old. The hardwood floors bore permanent stains from her accidents. "Quentin, you're being ridiculous. I just want things to be more equitable between us." I found what I was looking for: Morrison and Associates Property Management. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. If Jolene wanted to play business games, I'd give her a master class. "You're absolutely right," I said, picking up my phone. "Let's make this official." The next morning, I sat across from Harold Dillard in his cramped office at Morrison and Associates. The name connection to Greg Morrison was purely coincidental. Harold had assured me they weren't related, though his dry smile suggested he'd fielded that question before. "So, your wife wants to charge you rent to live in a house you own," Harold said, reviewing the notes I'd provided. He was a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible landlord-tenant dispute. Half-own, technically. Her name was added to the title after we married. And she's requesting $1,500 monthly? That's correct. Harold removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. Mr. Chen? It's Quentin Reed, I corrected. Apologies. Mr. Reed, I have to ask, are you certain you want to proceed with this? Once we draft a formal lease agreement, both parties become legally bound to its terms. I'm very certain. Very well. Harold pulled out a standard lease form. If your wife wants to be a landlord, she'll need to understand what that entails. Property taxes on your home are approximately $8,000 annually, correct? $8,200. Insurance runs about $1,200 yearly. Maintenance and repairs, let's be conservative and estimate $2,000 annually. That's roughly $11,000 in carrying costs. I nodded, watching him calculate. As half-owner demanding rent, she'd be responsible for half those costs, $5,500 annually. That's roughly $460 monthly, before we factor in the security deposit. Security deposit? Harold's smile was thin but satisfied. Standard practice. First month's rent plus security deposit equal to 1 month's rent. Given the property value and condition concerns, you mentioned pet damage, I'd recommend a deposit of $2,000. I thought about Princess's latest destruction. She'd somehow gotten into the pantry and shredded a bag of flour across the kitchen floor while we were out. Jolene had left it for me to clean up. That seems reasonable. Now, about the pet situation. Most residential leases include strict pet policies, breed restrictions, behavior clauses, additional deposits. Given the existing damage you've described, we might need to include a pet addendum with specific terms. Harold spent the next hour walking me through standard lease provisions. Late fees, maintenance request procedures, guest policies, noise ordinances. By the time we finished, the document was 12 pages long. One final consideration, Harold said as I prepared to leave. If your wife fails to meet her obligations under this lease, late payments, property damage, violation of terms, you'll have legal grounds for eviction proceedings. Eviction? It's standard landlord protection. 30-day notice to quit for lease violations, formal eviction process if the situation isn't resolved. Of course, as a married couple, the situation would be complicated, but legally speaking, a lease is a lease. I left Harold's office with a folder containing 3 copies of the most comprehensive residential lease agreement I'd ever seen. Jolene wanted to play landlord. She was about to get a graduate-level education in property management. That evening, I found Jolene in the living room with her laptop, working on what she claimed was a freelance article but looked suspiciously like a Facebook message thread. Princess was sprawled across the white sofa, another item that had suffered under the dog's reign of terror. "How was work?" she asked without looking up. "Productive. I took care of that rental situation we discussed." Now I had her attention. She closed the laptop and turned to face me. "You did?" I pulled the lease agreement from my briefcase and set it on the coffee table. I hired Morrison and Associates to handle the paperwork. They specialize in residential property management. Jolene picked up the document, her eyes widening as she flipped through the pages. This is a real lease. You said you wanted a business arrangement. This is how business arrangements work. She was scanning the first page, her face growing pale. Security deposit of $2,000? First month's rent due upon signing? Standard terms. Harold, that's our property manager, explained that landlords typically collect first month plus deposit up front. It protects against damages and ensures tenant commitment. Tenant commitment? Jolene's voice was rising. "Quentin, I live here." "And now you'll be living here as my landlord, once you sign the lease and collect the appropriate fees. Speaking of which, your portion of the property taxes will be due next month. That's about $460, plus insurance costs." Jolene was now reading more carefully, her finger tracing lines of text. What is this about pets? Oh, that's the pet addendum. Harold insisted we include it given Princess's history. There's an additional monthly pet fee of $75, plus a separate pet deposit of $500, and of course the behavior clauses. Behavior clauses? I leaned over and pointed to Section 12. Excessive barking, property damage, waste cleanup requirements, pretty standard stuff. If Princess violates the pet agreement, you'll be responsible for damages plus a penalty fee. As if summoned, Princess chose that moment to jump down from the sofa and squat on the hardwood floor. Jolene watched in horror as a puddle formed beneath the dog. That would fall under Section 12C, I noted helpfully. Failure to maintain proper waste management. There's a $50 cleanup fee for each incident. Jolene stared at the lease agreement, then at the puddle, then back at the lease. Quentin, this is insane. You can't seriously expect me to pay all this. I don't expect you to pay anything. But if you want to be my landlord, these are the terms. Harold was very clear about industry standards. Industry standards? We're married. And you wanted to treat our living arrangement as a business transaction. This is what business transactions look like. I stood up and headed toward the kitchen to get paper towels for Princess's latest mess. Take your time reviewing the lease. Harold said you have 48 hours to sign and provide the required deposits, or we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements. Behind me, I heard Jolene frantically flipping through pages, muttering under her breath. I allowed myself a small smile as I grabbed the paper towels. She'd wanted to play games with my house? Game on. The next morning brought the first real test of Jolene's landlord ambitions. I woke to find her in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, with the lease agreement spread across the breakfast table. She looked like she'd been up most of the night. "Morning," I said cheerfully, starting the coffee maker. "Sleep well?" "Quentin, we need to talk about this lease." "What about it?" "It's completely unreasonable. Look at Section 7. You're requiring me to maintain a property management escrow account for repairs and maintenance. I don't have that kind of money." I poured coffee into my travel mug. "That's standard for rental properties. Landlords need liquid funds for emergency repairs. What if the furnace breaks or the roof leaks? But I can't afford to keep $3,000 in an account I can't touch." "Then maybe being a landlord isn't for you." I shrugged. "We could go back to the original arrangement. I own the house, pay all the expenses, and you live here as my wife." Jolene's jaw tightened. "That's not fair either. Life rarely is, but business is business." I was heading toward the door when she called after me. "What about Section 15, the guest policy?" Section 15 was one of Harold's more creative additions. It limited overnight guests to 3 consecutive nights without written permission from the property owner, me. Given that Greg Morrison had been making increasingly frequent business visits that stretched well into the evening, I thought it was particularly relevant. "What about it?" "It says I need your written permission for guests staying more than 3 nights. "Correct. It's a liability issue. Insurance doesn't cover long-term guests who aren't on the lease." Jolene's face flushed. "So, if my friend Miriam visits for a week, I need your permission?" Miriam was Jolene's writing group friend, a gossipy woman who'd been encouraging Jolene's increasingly entitled behavior. She'd also been the one to suggest that Jolene deserved financial compensation for contributing to the household. That's what the lease says. And what about business associates? There it was. Greg Morrison might be sleeping with my wife, but he wasn't going to be doing it under my roof without following proper procedures. Business associates would fall under the same policy, though I'm curious what kind of business associates require overnight stays. Jolene's flush deepened. "Writing collaborations. Sometimes we work late." "I'm sure you do. Well, the lease covers all situations. Just submit a written request 48 hours in advance, and I'll consider it." I left her staring at the lease agreement, Princess yapping at my heels as I headed to the garage. The dog had developed an annoying habit of following me around the house, apparently sensing the shift in household dynamics. At work, my colleague, Riley Martinez, found me in the break room around lunchtime. Riley was one of the few people who knew about my marriage problems, mainly because he'd been the one to spot Jolene having lunch with Greg Morrison at a downtown restaurant while she was supposedly at a writing workshop. "You look unusually cheerful for a man whose wife is screwing a real estate agent," Riley observed, grabbing a soda from the vending machine. "Jolene and I have reached a new understanding about our living arrangement." "Understanding?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the lease agreement. Riley read the first page, his eyebrows climbing higher with each paragraph. "Holy shit, Quentin, you actually did it." "Did what?" "You weaponized paperwork. This is beautiful." He scrolled down to the pet addendum. $75 monthly pet fee? Princess is going to cost her $900 a year just in fees. Plus the behavior penalties. That dog has cost me more in damages than my car payment. Riley was grinning now. What did she say when she read it? She's still reading it. Harold was very thorough. Harold? The property manager. Jolene wanted to be a landlord, so I got her professional help. You're evil. I respect that. Riley handed me back the phone. So what happens when she can't pay? Then we'll discuss alternative arrangements. Such as? I smiled. Let's see how the next few days go. That evening, I returned home to find Jolene pacing the living room while talking on the phone. Princess was barking at something outside, her shrill yapping echoing through the house. I know it sounds crazy, but he actually hired a property management company, Jolene was saying. No, Miriam, I'm not kidding. It's a real lease with deposits and everything. She noticed me and lowered her voice. I have to go. Yes, I'll call you later. How's the lease review going? I asked. Quentin, this is ridiculous. You know I can't afford all these fees and deposits. Then perhaps you should reconsider the rental arrangement. But I deserve to have equity in this house. I've been contributing to the household for 3 years. Contributing how? The question hung in the air. Jolene's freelance writing brought in maybe $800 a month on good months. She didn't cook, rarely cleaned, and spent most of her time either at writing group meetings or entertaining Princess. I contribute emotionally. I make this a home. Emotional contributions don't pay property taxes. You're being deliberately difficult. I sat down in my recliner, the one Princess hadn't destroyed yet, and picked up the remote. I'm being practical. You wanted a business arrangement, so I gave you one. If you can't meet the terms, we can discuss alternatives. What alternatives? You could sign a post-nuptial agreement returning the house to my sole ownership, and we go back to the way things were. Jolene's eyes flashed. Absolutely not. Then I guess you need to figure out how to come up with the deposits. She stared at me for a long moment, then grabbed her phone and stalked out of the room. I heard her dialing as she headed upstairs. Greg, it's me. We have a problem. I turned up the volume on the television and smiled. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang, followed immediately by Princess's frantic barking. Through my window, I could see a silver Audi in the driveway, Greg Morrison's car. Jolene answered the door before I could get there, and I heard Greg's voice in the foyer. This is harassment, Jolene. He can't force you to sign this. He says it's a legitimate business arrangement. It's manipulation. No reasonable person would agree to these terms. I appeared in the doorway, and Greg turned to face me. He was everything I wasn't. Tall, conventionally handsome, with the kind of confident smile that probably closed a lot of real estate deals. He was also sleeping with my wife, and apparently felt entitled to have opinions about my household arrangements. Greg, what brings you by? I'm here as Jolene's friend and advisor. This lease you've drafted is completely unreasonable. I didn't draft it. Morrison and Associates Property Management drafted it. Professional work. Greg's confident expression faltered slightly. Morrison and Associates? You know them? Harold Dillard is handling the account. He mentioned the firm has an excellent reputation for residential property management. Yes, they're well regarded. Good to know. So as a real estate professional, you can confirm that the lease terms are industry standard? Greg looked trapped. He couldn't criticize a lease drafted by a respected property management firm without undermining his own credibility. The terms might be standard for commercial properties, but this is a marital home, which Jolene wants to treat as a rental property. I'm simply accommodating her request. Jolene stepped between us. Greg thinks there might be legal issues with the lease. What kind of legal issues? Greg straightened his tie, clearly uncomfortable. Spousal rights, property law. There are protections for married couples. Absolutely. Which is why I had professionals draft the agreement. Harold was very careful to ensure everything complies with state law. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Harold's contact information. Would you like to speak with him directly? I'm sure he'd be happy to explain the legal framework. That's not necessary, Greg said quickly. I insist. Professional to professional. I hit the call button and put the phone on speaker. Harold answered on the second ring. Dillard Property Management. Harold, it's Quentin Reed. I have a question about the lease we discussed. There's some concern about the legal validity of the agreement. Legal validity? Mr. Reed. That agreement was drafted according to standard Illinois residential property law. Every clause has been tested in court. Even in cases involving married couples? Especially in cases involving married couples. Spousal property rights don't override contractual obligations freely entered into by both parties. If Mrs. Reed signs that lease, she's legally bound to its terms. Greg's face had gone pale. Thank you, Harold. That clarifies things. Of course. Is Mrs. Reed ready to sign? I'll need the security deposit and first month's rent within 48 hours of execution. I'll let you know. I hung up and looked at Greg. Any other legal concerns? This is insane, Greg muttered. What's insane is a married woman demanding rent from her husband while her boyfriend provides legal advice in the marital home. The words hung in the air like a slap. Jolene gasped, and Greg's face flushed red. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You're here, in my house, advising my wife on how to extract money from me. What would you call that relationship? I'm a friend helping with a difficult situation. How often do friends require overnight stays to discuss difficult situations? Greg's mouth opened and closed without sound. Jolene looked like she wanted to disappear. I think you should leave, I said calmly. Jolene should probably focus on reviewing the lease terms. She has until tomorrow to decide. Greg looked at Jolene, who wouldn't meet his eyes, then back at me. This isn't over. Actually, it is. And Greg? The lease includes a guest policy. Future visits will need to be approved in writing. He stormed out, leaving Jolene and me standing in the foyer. Princess had finally stopped barking and was now sniffing around the spot where Greg had been standing. You had no right to embarrass him like that, Jolene said quietly. He had no right to be here discussing my private business. He's trying to help. He's trying to help you take my house. There's a difference. Jolene looked at the lease agreement still sitting on the coffee table. What happens if I don't sign? Then we discuss alternative arrangements. Such as? A post-nuptial agreement. You sign over any claim to the house, and we go back to the way things were. And if I refuse that too? I shrugged. Then we have a problem. Because you can't demand rent without being a landlord, and you can't be a landlord without accepting the responsibilities that come with it. Jolene stared at me for a long moment. When did you become so cold? When my wife decided to turn our marriage into a business transaction. She went upstairs without another word, leaving me alone with Princess, who was now chewing on one of Greg's business cards that had fallen from his pocket. Even the dog had more sense than to trust him. The 48-hour timeline arrived with no word from Jolene. She'd spent the previous day making phone calls and researching property law, but hadn't said a word about her decision. I found her that morning in the kitchen, staring at the lease agreement while Princess destroyed a throw pillow in the living room. "Time's up," I said, pouring coffee. "I can't afford the deposits." "Then you can't be my landlord." "But I still deserve equity in this house." I sat down across from her. "Based on what?" 3 years of marriage, 3 years of making this a home." "What exactly have you contributed to this home, Jolene? And I want specifics." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "You don't cook. I handle all the meals or we order takeout. You don't clean. I hired a service because you refuse to do housework. You don't maintain the yard, handle repairs, or pay any of the household expenses. Your writing brings in maybe $800 a month on good months, which doesn't even cover your personal expenses. That's not fair. What's not fair is demanding rent for a house you've contributed nothing toward, while carrying on an affair with a real estate agent who's probably been feeding you ideas about property values and equity." Jolene's face went white. "I am not having an affair." "Then explain Greg's overnight visits. Explain the late-night phone calls. Explain why you're suddenly interested in property equity after 3 years of being perfectly happy to let me handle everything." "Greg is helping me understand my rights. Greg is helping himself to my wife." The accusation hung between us like a live wire. Jolene's hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup. "You're paranoid. I'm observant. There's a difference." My phone buzzed with a text from Harold. "Has Mrs. Reed made a decision? I have other clients interested in property management services." I showed Jolene the message. "Harold needs an answer. Sign the lease and pay the deposits, or we move to alternative arrangements." "I need more time." "Time's up. Make a choice." Jolene stared at the lease, then at me. "What if I agree to the post-nuptial agreement?" "Then you sign over any claim to the house, and we go back to the original arrangement. You live here as my wife, not my landlord." "And Greg? What about Greg?" "You can't forbid me from having friends. I can forbid overnight guests in my house, especially guests who are actively trying to help you steal my property." Jolene's eyes flashed. "It's not stealing if I'm legally entitled to it." "You're not legally entitled to anything. Your name is on the title because I added it as a gesture of trust. That was clearly a mistake." "So you want me to sign away my rights for nothing?" "I want you to acknowledge reality. You have no rights to a house you've never contributed to, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Jolene stood up abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the lease agreement, soaking through the pages. "There, problem solved." I calmly reached for paper towels and began cleaning up the mess. "Harold has backup copies, and you just destroyed a legal document, which could be considered tampering." "You're bluffing." I pulled out my phone and called Harold. "Harold, Jolene just destroyed the lease agreement. Do you have copies?" "Of course." "Should I interpret this as a refusal to sign?" "Hold on." I looked at Jolene. "He wants to know if you're refusing to sign." She stood frozen, coffee dripping from the table. "Harold, I think we need to move to the alternative arrangement we discussed." "The post-nuptial agreement?" "That's correct. I'll have the paperwork ready this afternoon." I hung up and looked at Jolene. "You've got until this afternoon to decide. Sign the post-nup, or we proceed with formal eviction proceedings." "Eviction? You can't evict me from my own house." "It's not your house. Your name is on the title, but you have no legal right to occupy the property without either paying rent as agreed or relinquishing your claim." "That's insane." "That's property law. Ask Greg. He's the real estate expert." Jolene grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen. I heard her car start and pull out of the driveway, tires squealing. I finished cleaning up the coffee and sat down to wait. Harold was right. Once you start legal proceedings, both parties become bound by the law. Jolene had wanted to play games with my house. Now she was about to learn what happens when games become legal reality. My phone rang an hour later. It was Riley. "Dude, your wife just showed up at Greg Morrison's office having a complete meltdown. My cousin works in the same building. She says Jolene was screaming about lawyers and eviction notices." "Interesting. What did you do?" "I gave her a choice. Sign a post-nuptial agreement or face eviction proceedings." "You can evict your own wife?" "According to Harold, if she refuses to pay rent as agreed and won't relinquish her claim to the property, she becomes a holdover tenant. Same rules apply." Riley was quiet for a moment. "Quentin, you've officially crossed into supervillain territory. I'm impressed and slightly terrified. She started this game. I'm just playing by the rules." "What happens now?" "Now we see how much Greg Morrison really cares about Jolene's property rights when they come with actual legal consequences." The answer came sooner than expected. At 3 o'clock, Jolene returned home with red eyes and a grim expression. She found me in my office working on code while Princess barked at the mailman. "I'll sign the post-nup," she said quietly. "Smart choice. But I have conditions." I looked up from my computer. "You're not in a position to make conditions. I want to stay in the house. As my wife, not my landlord. And I want you to stop harassing Greg." "I've never harassed Greg. I've simply enforced boundaries in my own home." Jolene's jaw tightened. "He's been getting calls from Harold about property management services. His boss thinks he recommended your company to a client and wants to know why he's not getting commission." I smiled. "Harold mentioned he was expanding his client base. Good for him. You did this on purpose." "I hired a property management company. What Harold does with his business contacts is his decision." "You're destroying Greg's career." "Greg destroyed his own career when he decided to sleep with married clients." "We are not sleeping together." "Then you won't mind if I install security cameras to monitor overnight guests." Jolene stared at me, trapped. If she was innocent, she couldn't object to cameras. If she was guilty, the cameras would prove it. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll sign your post-nup. But this marriage is over. The marriage was over the day you demanded rent. We're just making it official." Harold arrived at 4 o'clock with the post-nuptial agreement. It was simpler than the lease, just 3 pages that transferred Jolene's interest in the house back to me in exchange for debt forgiveness and the right to remain as a guest until she found alternative housing. Jolene signed without reading it, her hand shaking as she wrote her name. "Congratulations," Harold said as he witnessed the signature. "You're now officially a guest in Mr. Reed's home." After Harold left, Jolene and I stood in the living room, the signed agreement between us like a barrier. "I hope you're happy," she said. "I'm satisfied. There's a difference. What happens now? Now you live here as my guest until you decide what you want to do with your life? No more games, no more demands, no more overnight visitors. And us?" I looked at the woman I'd married 3 years ago, remembering the person I thought she was. "There is no us, Jolene. There's just a woman who tried to steal my house and failed." She went upstairs without another word. Princess followed her, apparently sensing that the power structure in the house had permanently shifted. I sat down in my recliner and opened my laptop. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of removing Jolene's name from the title. Tonight, I was going to enjoy the silence of my own home. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. 3 weeks later, Jolene was gone. She'd moved in with Miriam temporarily, taking Princess and most of her belongings. The house felt different without the constant drama. Quieter, cleaner, and definitively mine again. I was reviewing the final paperwork when Riley stopped by with beer and curiosity. "So it's really over?" he asked, settling into the recliner that Princess had never quite managed to destroy. "It's over. Jolene signed a quitclaim deed last week. The house is back in my name only." "And Greg?" I smiled. Greg Morrison is no longer employed by Morrison and Associates Real Estate. Turns out, Harold Dillard mentioned Greg's consulting work with married clients to some mutual professional contacts. Word travels fast in the real estate community. Ouch. Greg's also facing some questions about his expense accounts. Apparently, those overnight business trips with clients weren't as legitimate as he claimed. Riley shook his head. You really went nuclear on this whole situation. I defended my property using legal means. Everything I did was completely above board. Technically legal and morally justified aren't always the same thing. Neither is demanding rent from your husband while sleeping with another man. Fair point. Riley opened his beer. So what's next? I'm selling the house. What? I pulled out a folder containing real estate listings and market analyses. I never wanted to be a landlord, and I definitely don't want to live in a house that's been contaminated by 3 years of lies and manipulation. I'm selling and starting fresh. Where will you go? I found a condo downtown. No yard to maintain, no memories to deal with, and definitely no room for unruly pets. Riley looked around the living room. This place has to be worth more now than when you bought it. About $60,000 more according to the market analysis. Enough for a nice down payment on something that's actually mine. And Jolene gets nothing? Jolene gets exactly what she contributed. Nothing. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jolene. Greg and I are getting married. I thought you should know. I showed Riley the message. He whistled low. That was fast. Not really. They've probably been planning this for months. The rent scheme was just their way of trying to get money out of me before they made it official. You think she was planning to leave all along? I think she was planning to have her cake and eat it too. Keep the house, keep the husband, and add the boyfriend. When that didn't work, she tried to extract as much value as possible before jumping ship. Cold. Practical. Jolene always was practical about money. I typed back a simple response. Congratulations. I hope you're both very happy together. Riley read over my shoulder. That's it? What else is there to say? I don't know. Something about karma? About how they deserve each other? They do deserve each other, but that's their problem now, not mine. Another text came through, this time from an unknown number. This is Greg. I want you to know that Jolene and I are in love. We have been for months. You never appreciated what you had. I showed Riley, who snorted with laughter. He's actually trying to justify stealing your wife by claiming you didn't appreciate her? Apparently. I typed back, thank you for taking her off my hands. I hope you enjoy paying her bills. Dude, that's brutal. But true. Greg's about to discover what I learned 3 years ago. Jolene is very expensive to maintain. My phone rang. It was Harold Dillard. Mr. Reed, I wanted to follow up on your property sale. I have a client who's very interested in your house. Excellent. What's their offer? Full asking price, cash deal, 30-day closing. I looked at Riley and grinned. Perfect. Send me the paperwork. There's one more thing, Harold said. My client mentioned they're planning to convert the property to a rental. They asked if I knew any good property management companies. I'm sure you can recommend someone? Indeed, Morrison and Associates has an excellent reputation. After I hung up, Riley shook his head in amazement. You're going to make money on this whole disaster. I'm going to make a lot of money. And I'm going to do it without compromising my integrity or breaking any laws. Meanwhile, Jolene gets to be married to an unemployed real estate agent with a reputation for sleeping with clients. And Greg gets to be married to a woman who demands rent from her husbands. They're perfect for each other. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking beer and watching the sun set through windows that would soon belong to someone else. You know what the best part is? I said finally. What? I don't have to listen to Princess Bark anymore. Riley laughed. Simple pleasures. The simplest. My phone buzzed one more time. Another text from Jolene. I know you think you won, but you lost the best thing that ever happened to you. I deleted the message without responding. Some conversations aren't worth having. Instead, I opened my laptop and began browsing furniture websites. My new condo was going to need furnishing, and for the first time in years, I could buy exactly what I wanted without worrying about pet damage or someone else's opinions. Freedom, I realized, was worth every penny of the legal fees. 2 months later, I was settled into my downtown condo when Riley called with news. "You're going to love this," he said. "Jolene and Greg are having problems." "Already?" "Apparently, marriage is expensive when both people expect the other person to pay for everything. Greg's been working as a part-time insurance agent since he lost his real estate license, and Jolene's freelance income isn't covering their lifestyle." Shocking. It gets better. They're living in a one-bedroom apartment with Princess, who apparently doesn't handle apartment living well. The neighbors have been complaining about barking. And Jolene called Miriam crying about how Greg isn't the man she thought he was. Turns out he's not as generous with his money when it's his money being spent. I felt a brief moment of sympathy for Greg, then remembered him standing in my house advising my wife on how to extract money from me. Live and learn. There's more. Greg apparently suggested they get a bigger place and asked Jolene to contribute to the down payment. Let me guess. She doesn't have any money for a down payment. Bingo. Turns out 3 years of not contributing to household expenses doesn't build much savings. Imagine that. So now they're stuck in a tiny apartment with a neurotic dog, both expecting the other person to solve their financial problems. Sounds like a perfect match. Riley was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever feel bad about how it all worked out?" I looked around my condo, clean, quiet, organized exactly the way I wanted it. No pet stains, no damaged furniture, no drama. "No," I said finally. "I feel grateful." Grateful? Grateful that Jolene showed me who she really was before I wasted any more years on her. Grateful that I had the resources to protect myself legally. And grateful that I'm sitting in my own place, debt-free, with no one demanding rent. When you put it that way, the truth is, Riley, Jolene did me a favor. She wanted to turn our marriage into a business transaction, so I treated it like business. And in business, the person with better lawyers and more leverage wins. And you had both. I had both. 6 months later, I ran into Miriam at a coffee shop downtown. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, but I approached her table anyway. "Hello, Miriam." "Quentin, how are you?" "I'm well. How's Jolene?" Miriam's expression soured. "She's struggling." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you? Really?" I sat down across from her. "I'm sorry that she made choices that led to struggling. I'm not sorry that she's experiencing the consequences of those choices." "She says you destroyed her life." Jolene destroyed her own life when she decided to demand rent from her husband while carrying on an affair. I just refused to enable her. Miriam fidgeted with her coffee cup. "She really loved you, you know." "No, she didn't. She loved what I provided. Financial security, a nice house, someone to handle all the adult responsibilities while she played at being a writer. When she thought she could get those things without being married to me, she tried to cash out. That's a very cold way to look at it. It's an accurate way to look at it. Jolene made a calculated decision to demand equity in a house she'd never contributed to while planning to leave me for another man. When that plan failed, she tried to extract as much money as possible through legal manipulation. None of that sounds like love to me." Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "Greg left her." "When?" "Last month. He said he couldn't handle the financial pressure and the constant fighting." "And Princess?" "Jolene had to give her up. She couldn't afford the pet deposits for a new apartment." I felt a genuine pang of sympathy for the dog. Princess might have been poorly trained and destructive, but that wasn't her fault. "Where is she living now?" "With her sister in Milwaukee. She's working as a waitress while she tries to rebuild her writing career." "That's honest work." "She hates it." Most people hate working for a living. That's why they call it work. Miriam stood up abruptly. You really don't feel any guilt about this? I feel sad that my marriage failed. I feel disappointed that someone I trusted turned out to be manipulative and dishonest. But guilty? No. I protected myself using legal means against someone who was trying to steal my property. I'd do the same thing again. After Miriam left, I sat in the coffee shop thinking about the conversation. Did I feel guilty? Honestly, no. I felt relieved. Jolene had wanted to play games with my house, my money, and my trust. She'd enlisted her lover to help her manipulate me legally and financially. When I'd refused to be manipulated, she'd tried to paint me as the villain. But the truth was simpler than that. She'd made a series of bad choices based on greed and entitlement, and those choices had consequences. I wasn't responsible for protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. I finished my coffee and walked back to my condo, where I had plans to meet Riley for dinner. We were going to a new restaurant downtown.